in for a real treat tonight. We're very fortunate to have the distinguished international lawyer Robert Amsterdam with us to talk about his experiences in Russia and elsewhere during his long career in legal practice. Mr. Amsterdam is a member of the Canadian and International Bar Associations, earned his BA from Carleton University in Ottawa, and studied law at the Queen's University in Ontario. For the past 27 years, he's been practicing law, most recently as founding partner of the Toronto-based firm, Amsterdam Peroff. He's overseen numerous high-profile cases involving shareholder disputes, corporate restructuring, fraud and asset recovery, corporate human rights advocacy, and complex commercial litigation. He's also an advisor on political risk and corporate foreign policy. He has a great deal of international experience, not only in Russia, but also in Hungary, Nigeria, Venezuela, and Guatemala, representing very senior international clients, including most prominently, since 2003, the former CEO of the Yukos oil company, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Please join me in welcoming to the University of Chicago, Robert Amsterdam.
I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm going to start by talking about the news that's occurred in the last 24 hours. And crazily enough, having grown up as a baseball fanatic, for some reason, when I heard that news, I thought of a Boston Red Sox player named Carl Yastrzemski. And I don't know why Vladimir Putin and Carl Yastrzemski were tied together in my mind, but I watched Yastrzemski when I was a boy, and I remembered his final game. And in fact, today is the 24th anniversary of his final game. And I always thought that there was a life's lesson in that kind of athlete who does a tremendous job in his chosen profession and knows when to leave the field. In Russia today, Mr. Putin, and let me make clear, I firmly believe he has no desire to stay on. It is not that he is desperate for political power. It is that he has no way out. If you engage in the destruction of the rule of law in as systematic and sweeping away as Mr. Putin has done, there is no possibility that your future can be guaranteed. There is, in fact, in his mind, no guarantee that the very arrangement he came to with his predecessor can be met with the next leader of the Russian Federation. And it is also clear that the incredible level of Byzantine fighting within the clans in the highest levels of the Kremlin has reached a point where he must cling to the ring of power, because that is the only way that this fighting can in any sense be controlled. We in the West, and particularly in the United States, have no understanding of the dramatic instability at the top of Russia today. In fact, there is a narrative spun by an individual who will forever go down in history as the pillar of both opportunism and treachery to his own people. The former German Chancellor Schroeder. There is a sense in dealing with that we have going on today that Germany had decided with Mr. Schroeder that there was going to be an acceptance of a very Faustian bargain. The Germans were going to get stability in Russia, and the Russians were going to live with autocracy. And Mr. Schroeder was prepared to name that autocrat a Democrat, and he was prepared to campaign for Mr. Putin as a Democrat to all the leaders of the West, even to that leader who saw in Mr. Putin a spy who had engaged in various nefarious activities during his period in Dresden, even to some leader in the West who saw in Mr. Putin a soul. So we have this unique situation now where Mr. Putin is bound up by his own compromises and by his own deals and arrangements. And this has been brought about in a way that has just been identified by a number of British professors as a securitizing narrative. And a securitizing narrative is a narrative which consistently is based on the development of a dialectic, an either-or scenario, for which Russian history is very rich. I call it the victim narrative, the idea that Russia has been the victim of the West in the 90s, the victim of the West in the 40s, with some great deal of reality and 20 million civilian deaths. And this victim narrative then gets manipulated and extended so that it moves from reality to an instrument of control. And we go from the Great Patriotic War to a view of new immigrants in Russia, which so desperately needs immigration, as a tremendous security threat, which further glorifies the power ministries. We see in the security doctrine a media security doctrine, one of the first things adopted under Vladimir Putin's rule, securitizing the media and identifying the media as an area of danger for the development of democracy in Russia. We see in that narrative a development in respect to the buildup that we're seeing in Russia right now with the armed forces, and clearly we see in that narrative the development of energy and resource nationalism as a method of control. Today, one day after the parliamentary elections in Ukraine, we have another attempt by Gazprom to cut off supplies to Ukraine. There is no question that the fact that President Putin could announce that he was going to move to become prime minister at the very moment when this loss in Ukraine takes place, and then move so quickly to repeat the lessons of 2 years ago with the Orange Revolution, demonstrate the overwhelming impunity he continues to feel he enjoys. And he enjoys that impunity because this administration in particular believes, number one, they are hostage to Russia in respect to Iran, which is, in terms of any sort of historical analysis, an amazing thing to believe. And number two, and I think this is very important near the anniversary of Anna Politkovskaya's death, because the same securitizing phenomena that turned a horrendous tragedy in a school in Beslan into the end of federalism in Russia has brought in this country a tremendous use of the same fear and securitization to transmogrify the office of the president, to expand the search and seizure powers, and to dramatically change the very environment of civil liberties and human rights in the United States today. It is very important that we understand this securitizing formula because it explains the close relationship the United States and Russia have in certain strategic areas still, and the unwillingness of the Bush administration to complain loudly or say anything at all concerning Chechnya. We have, over the last number of years, stood in silence to Guantanamo and silence to Chechnya, and there is a commonality there and it is incredibly important that in terms of the issues of human rights that are so central to us all, that we not allow the human rights agenda to be taken over by those who want to use some argument of cultural relativity to exclude some of our most basic and fundamental rights, freedoms, and tenets. Right now, I act for a political prisoner being held illegally under Russian law in Siberia, 6,000 miles from his home. He is in this camp in Siberia because the West was prepared to be silent at his show trial, and because the West was silent when his corporation was illegally taken, when these bogus taxes were assessed, and then some of the leading Western companies were prepared to participate in this orgy of destruction and actually attempt to launder the reputation of the Kremlin, using the phony auctions as a way to gain what I call Putin points. Putin points is a very important thing to understand. It's how Russia is ruled today. All of us know the point system. It substitutes for meals in airplanes. You take a certain carrier, you get a certain number of points, and then you get some sort of free trip so that you can be delayed once again. And in dealing with the Kremlin, there is this incredible movement towards non-transparency outside of the rule of law, such that you're in a situation in the Kremlin where the way you talk the language of the Kremlin is you call them Democrats, you agree to working with either Gazprom or Rosneft, whichever is the one particular energy company you need at the time, and you agree to negotiate bilaterally with the Kremlin. This is one of the most important strategic options the Kremlin faces, which is they are big disaggregators. They don't want to deal with the EU, they want to deal with everyone separately. They don't want to deal with NATO, they're prepared to deal with the United States, and it is one of their key themes. And it's what's led in Europe to tremendous divisiveness and to what we call queue jumping. Italy has now taken over Germany's place under Schroeder and has jumped to the head of the line. And because they participated in an illegal UCOS auction, they managed to get a part of the new 25% or so liberalized electrical reform that took place in Russia, and they were able to buy some distribution assets. The point of all of this is that transparency and the rule of law are fundamental to growth. They are fundamental not only to human rights, but to economic development. And the reason why they have become so dangerous to pursue in Russia, why my client is in jail because of transparency, and why journalists are dead because of their interest in transparency, and while other newspapers and radio stations are tremendously impacted, is because there is a tremendous danger in the truth getting out. The fact of the matter is, oil exploration in Russia has been going down precipitously each year. This year, Gazprom will actually produce less gas than last year. Russia today is more dependent on energy exports than it was in 1991. And this malaise on energy is a political issue. It is a political determinant that was brought about by Mr. Putin because there is, in fact, no Putin industrial policy to speak of. There has been a policy, and it has been a concerted policy, to enhance the power ministries and strongly take control over energy in Russia. And what that has led to is the Kremlin controlling over 40% of oil in Russia in terms of the market, and in terms of gas, with Gazprom's ownership, and outside of a few competitors, the control is almost total. And that has been used, as I said earlier, as a political weapon, and it continues to be used day by day. And whether it's Georgia, whether it's Estonia, whether it's Germany, whether it's the United Kingdom, or whether it's the United States, there is this lack of transparency leading to a tremendous growth in what I have called corporate foreign policy, which is the ability of corporate actors to engage in foreign policy without any form of review. In Germany, it goes on with Eon Ruhrgas. In Italy, it's Eni. But in the United Kingdom, it's British Petroleum. These companies that are decisive in terms of the Russia relationship, who have managed to make a tremendous impact on the relationship between their own executive and the Russian executive, because the Russian executive has convinced people not only of the victim narrative in terms of Russian history, but the scarcity narrative, and the fact that you cannot but concede to Russian power in the energy sphere if you want to make any number of related deals, whether it's in respect to Kosovo, whether it's in respect to some of the economic relationships that are hanging fire, whether it's in relation to the Energy Charter, which the United States as well has not signed, but which Russia did sign, but argues it will not ratify. This ongoing willingness to defy international law in terms of treaties is best exemplified by the European Convention of Human Rights. There are today in Strasbourg literally 40,000 applications, either from Russia or other countries within the CIS. Strasbourg, which is the human rights home of Europe, is so completely inundated that it has barely the ability to respond. It is drowning in the sea of complaints because, unfortunately, in terms of Russia today, the independence of the judiciary has been completely compromised. And with the exhaustion of that judicial independence, there is no control on the virus that is Chechnya. Let me tell you, from having worked in Russia in this trial before I was arrested, Chechnya is not a description of a location on a map. Chechnya in Russia is a psychology. You cannot have your boys go and experience what the Russian army experiences in Chechnya and have them then turn into the police and prosecutors in your hometown and not understand that it will change forever your internal dynamics. Russia is suffering from Chechnya as much as Grozny is suffering. And you see it. You see it with the fear. You experience it. It's very hard for me to talk about the fact that today is the anniversary, or not today, in a few days will be the anniversary of the murder of Khodorkovsky. Not only is she to me a living, breathing, laughing human being, but she was a tremendous Western, if you will, conscience. And I don't mean that as being in any way non-Russian, because she was completely Russian. But she was completely willing to laugh at some of the aspects of Russian society that today it is almost impossible to laugh at. She was able to assess the situation within her own country and understand that it wasn't just that the Siloviki were in the process of dismembering federalism and the judiciary and all of these other critical sectors of society. What was the greater crime was that when she unearthed either the terrors of Chechnya or the grotesque corruption of the Kremlin, no one seemed to care. There was a movie in which she was captured talking with shock about the fact that one of the people in the Nordost attack, one of the actual terrorists in Nordost, was found to be working in the presidential administration 6 months later. And no one, when that article came out in Novaya Gazeta, even complained. And what shocked her so much was the development of this apathy. And that apathy comes as a result of what she called the doppelganger theory. And the doppelganger theory is very important, and it's completely true. A friend of mine is now on trial in Russia. His name is Andrei Pionkovsky. He is a great Russian writer and critic of the Kremlin. He is on trial for extremism. Now, Pionkovsky is extreme only in the fact that he believes Vladimir Putin is bad news and doesn't mind telling you about it. The people who are putting him on trial are the people who are funding the Nashi, which is a 100,000 strong group of thugs who walk around various cities attacking political opponents of the Kremlin. But the extremist is Pionkovsky. My client, Khodorkovsky, was the largest taxpayer in Russian history. So you charge him with tax evasion. This is how the doppelganger works. And by the time, when you're a citizen in a country like this, that you go through and you hear all of these stories and you taint these people like Khodorkovsky, by the time you're finished, you don't know what's up or down. You're atomized. You're unable to form a group. In fact, in our criminal case in Russia, it was the forming of this group. My client had an oil company. The Russian Federation decided that what they were going to do was turn Russia's most profitable company into something called an organized group so that they could put Mr. Khodorkovsky away for a decade. So that's what they did. They took Russia's most transparent company and they used the fact that Khodorkovsky put his holdings and his share structure on the web. They used this to demonstrate he had an organized group. And when we challenged them, they said, it's right here on the web. And so we said, but how many criminals publish their structure? How do you prove a criminal mafia-like organization about people who are disclosing all of this information? How is it done? And of course, all you see is, what I call the Putin shrug, because everybody knows. Everybody in that court knew. The prosecutors weren't prosecutors. The judges weren't judges. We barely felt like lawyers. It was a show trial. It was a show trial, and the fear that has developed since that time, 70 years after the days of Yezhov and the earlier show trials, demonstrate, unfortunately, where Russia is continuing to go. No matter what our companies who are there are telling us, the situation in Russia when it comes to rule of law is only deteriorating. Item 1, last week, in a publication by the World Bank, Russia sank to number 145 in the Global Corruption Index. Now, to be at number 145, you have to be somewhere around Zambia and Zimbabwe. Here is a member of the G8 that is ranking number 145 in corruption and is almost at the top of the list, number 3, in terms of the safety and security of journalists. What do those two numbers tell us? They tell us that Russia, in the post or pre-Putin period, however we're now going to call this new period, is going to be continuing in an unstable legal and political environment. The leading investigator, the leading anti-fraud investigator in the Russian Federation was murdered Saturday night. The leading bank reformer was murdered a year ago. And beware of the anti-corruption ministry, because if we follow Anna's advice, we all know they are the most corrupt. And why is the new prime minister formerly head of money laundering? Because he knows where everyone's accounts are. This is the 1984-like thinking that we need to start to understand. And when it comes to foreign policy, it is worse. Because when it comes to foreign policy, you have to consider the United States. And in this administration, the foreign policy review that will one day take place will have to find a new letter beside F. Because merely giving this administration a failing grade doesn't begin to cover it. How the United States could be now so weak in Latin America that Vladimir Putin could be a major pillar of support for Hugo Chavez, and Mr. Chavez could be talking to both Argentina and Brazil about importing Russian pipeline technology and using Russian pipeline technology to restructure the gas infrastructure of Latin America. And this could be done with a straight face, is beyond imagination. $4 billion in Russian arms to Venezuela. And that's before we talk about Iran. That's before we talk about Ahmadinejad. And the fact of the matter is, the technology being used by Iran today in the nuclear fight is Russian technology. And when we talk about Syria and what's going on in Syria today, the latest Russian anti-missile technology available has been sold and is now being put in place in Syria. We all have to be cautious of Russia, because when a country is engaged in the sale of both munitions and energy as their key export sectors, global instability represents boom times. And it is a very important moment we are in, because at the very moment that this instability exists in Russia, which many of our pundits are calling stability and are welcoming Mr. Putin's continuance in office, we will have the issue of Kosovo independence. And the Kosovo independence issue will be coming up right around the time of the Duma elections. So it is going to be a very serious time for all of us in respect to the very future of Central Europe and the very future of U.S.-Russia relations, as both countries enter what will be a critical election year. Now, I've already overstayed my time. I just want to take 60 seconds and say to you that there will be another Khodorkovsky trial. I don't feel it fair if I get a chance to speak to anyone and not mention the fact that not only has this man been stabbed, not only has he been placed over a uranium mine, not only has he been sent 6,000 miles from his family, but at the very hint of parole, the Russian authorities are now seeking to lay new charges. And these new charges are called money laundering. Again, you have to understand Anna's theory, because the people who have laundered the money are the people in the Kremlin. But they will nail him on largely the same facts they tried to get him for last time, but now they'll say that he moved the money so that they can get him for money laundering, put him away for another 10 to 15 years in an even more remote location. And Mikhail Khodorkovsky is not alone. There is a new generation of political prisoner in Russia today. Their names are Sutyagin, Danilov, Trepashkin, Bakhmina. I can go on and on. Svetlana Bakhmina, 32-year-old lawyer at Yukos, arrested at 5 a.m. in front of her 2 children in Moscow, taken to a detention facility, interrogated till she collapsed, taken to hospital, brought back, interrogated some more. She has not been seen for 3 years. She is in a labor facility in the Ural Mountains. She has never seen her children. And for the first 6 months of her incarceration, she was not allowed to speak to her children because the prosecutor general said that the only time she will see freedom is when her boss is brought back to Russia from London. So the prosecutor general was basically